All right, so get this. A newly elected president issues an executive order, and it directly targets 51 former intelligence officials and a former national security advisor.
Wow.
It sounds like something out of a political thriller.
Yeah, you would think.
But this is real, and it all comes down to accountability, or at least that's what the order claims.
Well, what's so fascinating here is how this order tries to connect to seemingly separate incidents. And they both raise some pretty critical questions about, the role of intelligence officials in this crazy political landscape we have.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have all the controversies surrounding the 2020 election and the letter signed by those 51 former intelligence officials you were talking about regarding Hunter Biden's laptop.
Mm-hmm.
And then, fast forward a few years and you have John Bolton, who was the former national security advisor, publishing his memoir, and it was deemed to contain classified information.
Oh, right.
So there's a lot to unpack here.
Okay, so let's try to break this down piece by piece.
Sounds good.
First, the 2020 election situation. Can you give us like a quick recap for those who might not remember all the details?
Sure.
About what happened with the Hunter Biden laptop story and why those intelligence officials even got involved?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So remember, it was right in the middle of the 2020 presidential campaign.
Yeah.
And a news story breaks about this laptop that allegedly belonged to Hunter Biden, who was the son of then-candidate Joe Biden.
Right.
The story had some potentially damaging information, and pretty quickly it just became this political football that everyone was kicking around.
Right.
Shortly after the story broke, 51 former intelligence officials signed a public letter, and in this letter they were casting doubt on the story's authenticity.
Wow.
They actually claimed it had all the classic earmarks of some kind of Russian disinformation campaign.
And that letter, it really added fuel to the fire, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
These weren't just random people signing this.
Right.
These were seasoned intelligence professionals.
Yeah, they had tons of experience.
Years of experience.
Exactly, and that's what made it so explosive. The letter itself was carefully worded. They emphasized that they didn't have specific evidence to prove that Russia was involved, but that their national security experience led them to believe it was a very likely possibility.
Oh, wow.
So immediately people started asking, were they using their former positions to try to influence the election?
Yeah, it makes you wonder.
It does.
And wasn't there something about this letter being reviewed by the CIA before it was even released?
Yes. There were reports that the letter was sent to the CIA's Pre-Publication Classification Review Board,
Okay.
which is the board that's responsible for evaluating materials for sensitive information before they are made public.
Got it.
So this board's involvement just added another layer of complexity to the whole thing, because it suggested that senior CIA officials were at least aware of the letter's contents before it was released to the public. So it raised a lot of eyebrows.
Yeah. So we have this letter potentially impacting the election narrative.
Yeah.
But then years later, this executive order comes out connecting it to John Bolton's memoir.
Right.
So how do those two events relate?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The executive order basically argues that both incidents represent abuses of power and trust by former intelligence officials.
Interesting.
In Bolton's case, his memoir was deemed to contain classified information, and they said it was potentially jeopardizing national security.
Right.
So the order uses this as an example of officials profiting from their access to this sensitive information.
Okay. So the executive order is trying to draw a clear line in the sand.
Yeah.
Saying intelligence officials should not be involved in electioneering and they shouldn't be profiting from their access to classified information.
Right.
But what are the specific mechanisms within the order itself?
Okay.
What's it actually trying to do?
So the order is actually surprisingly direct.
Interesting.
It explicitly revokes the security clearances of all 51 former intelligence officials who signed the letter and John Bolton. So that means they no longer have access to classified information.
Oh, wow.
And we're not just talking about, random people here.
Right.
These are very prominent figures, former directors of national intelligence, CIA, directors, other high-ranking officials.
Wow, that's a bold move.
It is.
Definitely sends a message.
Yeah.
Revoking security clearances just seems pretty extreme.
Yeah, it does.
What are the arguments in favor of such a drastic action?
Well, supporters of the order say it's a necessary step to restore public trust.
Okay.
They claim that these individuals abused their positions for political purposes.
Right.
And they say holding them accountable is absolutely crucial for maintaining faith in government institutions.
Makes sense.
They also think that it sends a strong message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated and that it'll deter similar actions in the future.
So the idea is that by taking a hard line,
Yeah.
it reinforces the idea that intelligence should be nonpartisan and it protects national security. But I imagine there are people who strongly disagree with this approach.
Of course.
What are their concerns?
Well, critics are saying that this order is politically motivated.
Right.
And that it could be targeting people from the previous administration as a form of payback.
Oh, wow.
They worry that this could set a dangerous precedent where future administrations could use similar tactics to silence any dissenting voices.
Okay. Yeah, I see that.
Right. And they're also raising concerns about the chilling effect this could have on future whistleblowers,
Yeah.
potentially discouraging people from coming forward with legitimate concerns out of fear of retaliation.
Right, because who wants to risk their whole career
Exactly.
to say something?
And their reputation.
Yeah.
If they think they're going to be punished for it later.
It's that age-old question, right?
It is.
Is justice being served, or is this just a political power play?
Yeah,
There are valid points on both sides.
absolutely.
So how do we, as informed citizens, begin to even analyze a situation like this?
Right.
Where do we start?
That's the key question. And I think it starts with understanding all the nuances of these arguments and the potential consequences of this executive order. It's not enough to just hear the headlines.
Right.
We need to dig in deeper, analyze all these different perspectives, and try to figure out the long-term implications.
Okay, so let's start unpacking those implications.
Right.
We've got this order that's trying to prevent the intelligence community from being used for partisan purposes.
Uh-huh.
But what are the benefits and drawbacks of this approach?
Okay.
Could it actually make us less safe in the long run?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And that's exactly where we need to dig deeper.
Yep.
Let's explore both sides of this and see if we can figure out what the potential ripple effects of this executive order might be.
Sounds good.
All right.
Okay, so we're talking about the potential consequences of this executive order, both good and bad.
Right.
So let's start with the potential benefits. What are some of the positive outcomes that could come from all of this?
Well, people who support this order argue that it could lead to a stronger and more trustworthy intelligence community
Okay.
by taking decisive action against individuals who allegedly abuse their positions. You know, it kind of reinforces the idea that there are actual consequences for doing something wrong.
Right.
And this could help deter future misconduct and help restore public confidence in intelligence agencies.
Yeah, it makes sense that people need to trust the intelligence community, especially when it comes to matters of national security.
Absolutely.
If people think that those agencies are being used for political purposes, then it completely undermines their credibility
It does.
and their effectiveness.
You're right.
So there's also this argument that this executive order could help protect national security
Yeah.
by preventing unauthorized disclosure of classified information.
Right. If former officials are no longer getting that sensitive intel, then it reduces the risk of leaks,
Right.
whether they're intentional or accidental.
So it's like a preventative measure to safeguard sensitive information by limiting who has access to it.
Exactly.
Okay, but couldn't that also have negative consequences?
Sure.
Don't we want former officials to be able to share their expertise and their insights even after they've left the government?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. Critics of the order say that it could stifle valuable dialogue and analysis, you know?
Right.
These former intelligence officials often have this unique knowledge and perspective that they could contribute to policy debates and to public understanding of complex issues.
Right.
So by silencing them, we're losing those insights.
And wouldn't it make people less likely to want to serve in the intelligence community in the first place?
Yeah, potentially.
If they know that their security clearance could be revoked later on,
Right.
and that could damage their careers and their reputations,
Yeah, exactly.
it might make them think twice about taking on those roles.
That's a big risk.
Yeah.
The potential chilling effect on recruitment and retention within the intelligence community.
Right.
It's a real concern.
Because why would you risk your whole career and reputation if you could face repercussions years down the line,
Right.
even if you believe you're acting in good faith?
You just never know.
So it's kind of this tightrope walk, isn't it?
It is.
Trying to balance accountability with the need for expertise
Yeah.
and the protection of national security.
It's complicated.
It's not as simple as just saying punish those who did wrong.
Nope.
There are so many layers to
Absolutely.
consider.
And that's why this case is so fascinating, why it sparked so much debate.
Yeah.
It forces us to grapple with these fundamental questions about the role of intelligence in a democracy, the limits of executive power, and that delicate balance between national security and individual rights.
This whole situation is a reminder that we can't just take our institutions for granted.
We can't.
We need to be vigilant. We need to be informed and engaged citizens.
Absolutely.
If we want to make sure the power is used responsibly and that our democracy stays strong.
Couldn't agree more. And speaking of vigilance and informed citizenry, there's another aspect of this executive order that we haven't even touched on yet.
Okay.
But it's pretty intriguing.
Oh, right. I remember reading about that.
Yeah.
It's that the order requires the Director of National Intelligence to submit a comprehensive report within 90 days, right?
Precisely. It's essentially an investigation into what those 51 former intelligence officials did and John Bolton.
So the report is supposed to go deeper into several key areas.
Yes, sir.
First, it's tasked with uncovering any additional inappropriate activities related to that letter about Hunter Biden's laptop.
Uh-huh. They're trying to find out if there was any coordination or collusion behind the scenes.
Okay.
If anyone exerted undue influence or if any laws or regulations were actually violated.
So it's going beyond just the content of the letter and looking into the context surrounding how it was created and released.
Exactly.
Trying to get to the bottom of what really happened.
Yeah, and who, if anyone, might have crossed the line.
And the second part of the report focuses on preventing future interference in elections by the intelligence community.
Right. The DNI has to come up with concrete recommendations and safeguards to prevent similar incidents from happening again.
So basically, a plan to ensure that intelligence agencies remain neutral and nonpartisan, especially during election cycles.
Exactly, because we've seen how damaging it can be when intelligence is perceived as being politicized.
Yeah.
It erodes public trust, and it can have a lot of really bad consequences.
And the final part of the report is maybe the most consequential.
It might be.
The DNI has to propose specific disciplinary actions for anyone who's found to have engaged in inappropriate or illegal activities.
Yeah, so we're not just talking about a slap on the wrist.
Right. This could be serious stuff.
It could.
Like further loss of security clearances,
Potential
fines, or even criminal charges.
It's possible.
This report has the potential to be a game changer.
It does.
It could lead to some really big repercussions for those who are involved. And it could really reshape how we think about the role of intelligence in our democracy. This is all getting pretty intense.
It is.
It feels like we're in uncharted territory.
It certainly feels that way. This executive order and the investigation that follows have the potential to fundamentally change the relationship between the intelligence community and the government, as well as how the public sees these institutions.
It makes you wonder if this is just the tip of the iceberg.
It does.
Are there deeper issues that play here that we haven't even begun to uncover?
It's a good question, and it's a reminder that we as citizens have a responsibility to stay informed, engage in critical thinking, and hold our leaders accountable no matter what side of the aisle they're on.
We've been talking about this executive order and all the potential consequences, the investigations, the possible disciplinary actions, the impact on the intelligence community as a whole. It's a lot.
It is a lot to process, isn't it? And one thing that keeps coming to mind for me is how this whole situation might actually fuel the political polarization that we're already seeing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, this case is already so intertwined with partisan politics.
It is.
You know, the 2020 election, Hunter Biden, John Bolton, these are all hot-button issues.
Absolutely.
That trigger strong emotions and deeply divided opinions.
Yeah, and the way people interpret this executive order, it's probably going to fall along those same partisan lines.
Right.
You know, some people will see it as this much-needed act of accountability, finally holding powerful figures responsible for their actions. But others are going to view it as a politically motivated witch hunt.
Right.
An attempt to silence dissent and punish those who dared to challenge the status quo.
It's almost like we're looking at two different realities.
It is.
And that makes it so difficult to even have a productive conversation about this issue.
It does.
So how do we even begin to bridge that divide?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I don't think anyone has all the answers.
Yeah.
But I think it starts with recognizing that this polarization is often driven by fear, mistrust, and a lack of empathy for people who hold different views.
Yeah, we get so caught up in our own echo chambers.
Right.
You know, surrounded by people who already think like us.
Exactly.
That we forget that there are other valid perspectives out there.
We do.
We start seeing the other side as the enemy.
Yeah.
Rather than, you know, fellow citizens who just have different interpretations of the same events.
It's like we're speaking different languages, even though we're all part of the same society.
Right.
And that's why it's so important to step outside of those echo chambers to actually try to seek out different viewpoints. And engage in a respectful dialogue, even when it's uncomfortable.
That's easier said than done.
It is.
Especially when you feel like your own values are being attacked.
Yeah. Or that the other side is just plain wrong.
Exactly.
It's definitely not easy, but I really believe that it's essential if we want to preserve our democracy. We have to find ways to communicate across these divides to at least try to understand where the other side is coming from, even if we don't agree with their conclusions.
This whole situation feels like a stress test for our democracy.
It does.
Can we even handle these kinds of disagreements, these fundamental differences in perspective, without resorting to demonization and division?
It's a test that we can't afford to fail. And I think the key here really lies in our ability to think critically, to question our own assumptions, and to recognize that there's rarely just one right answer to these complex issues.
So much of this comes down to nuance, doesn't it?
It really does.
Recognizing that there are shades of gray, things aren't always black and white.
Right. And that's something that we've kind of lost in our current political climate.
Yeah, we have.
You're absolutely right. Nuance is so crucial. And it requires us to be thoughtful, to actually listen to each other, and to be open to changing our minds when we get new information or different perspectives.
It's a reminder that learning is a lifelong process.
It is.
That we should always be open to new insights and be willing to challenge our own beliefs.
I couldn't agree more. And speaking of learning, one of the most valuable lessons we can take away from all of this is the importance of really understanding how complex power is.
How so?
Well, this executive order really shows us the tension between accountability and the potential for overreach.
Okay.
On the one hand, it's so important to hold people in positions of power accountable for what they do.
Yeah.
We can't just let people abuse their authority or betray the public trust without consequences.
We also have to be careful about actions that seem politically motivated.
Right.
Or that might discourage dissent and critical thinking within these government institutions.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance.
It is.
And this case raises some really important questions about where that line should be. How do we ensure accountability without creating a chilling effect that prevents people from speaking truth to power?
That's a great question. I think every listener should really think about that.
I agree.
Where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
How do you balance the need for accountability with the potential risks of going too far?
There's no easy answer, is there? It really depends on individual values and interpretations.
Right.
But just the fact that we're wrestling with these questions shows that we have an engaged and informed citizenry.
And that's what gives me hope,
Me too.
Despite all the challenges and divisions we're facing, there are still so many people out there who are committed to critical thinking, respectful dialogue, and the pursuit of truth.
Absolutely. And as long as that spirit is alive, I think we have reason to be optimistic about the future of our democracy.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's remember that this case is just one small piece of a much larger puzzle.
It is.
And it's a puzzle that we're all trying to solve together as we try to build a more just and equitable and informed society.
And that journey starts with each and every one of us. By having these critical conversations, questioning what we think we know and seeking out different perspectives, we can all create a more nuanced and understanding world.
So keep those questions coming. Keep those minds curious.
Yeah.
And keep striving to be the best informed citizens you can be.
Until next time, this is Study Hall signing off.